What if I told you that Mark Webber's message to Oscar Piastri after his podium in Japan was not a congratulation, but a warning disguised as pride? Because what happened after Suzuka is not what it seems. 4 months, Webber was the first to point out that Piastri was missing something key to being champion, and just when no one expected it, this podium arrives, and with it, a message that changes absolutely everything. The question is Webber really celebrating, or is he making it clear that now the real pressure begins? Before understanding the true meaning of Mark Webber's message after the podium in Japan, we must go back. Because this story does not begin with a celebration. It begins with a silent crisis that very few knew how to interpret at the time. During late 2025, Oscar Piastri was failing not because of a lack of talent, but because of something much more dangerous in Formula One. The inability to sustain performance when the pressure increased. While from the outside many continued to see a young promise with a competitive car, from the inside the reading was completely different. Webber saw it clearly, and that is why he was so direct. Piastri had to change his attitude. He had to make a mental leap if he really wanted to become a candidate for the title. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a condition. That moment marked a turning point. Because when a manager like Webber, who knows perfectly well what it means to compete at the highest level, publicly exposes that type of weakness, he is sending a double message. One towards the driver, and another towards the entire paddock. Piastri was no longer untouchable. He stopped being just the bright promise, and became a pilot under constant scrutiny. And that's where the transformation really begins. The most interesting thing is that this process was not immediate or visible. At the beginning of 2026, far from exploding in results, the narrative around Piastri remained uncertain. Rumors even arose about the relationship between the two, suggesting tensions or distancing, something that the environment itself was responsible for quickly cooling, clarifying that Webber was simply adopting a more strategic role, more from the shadows. But that detail is key because while on the outside it seemed like a step backwards, in reality it was part of the process. Less exposure, more internal reconstruction. At the same time, the context didn't help either. Formula One of 2025 and 2026 does not forgive. With an extremely competitive grid and teams like McLaren fighting directly at the top is already reflected with their consistency in results and evolution since 2024, each missed opportunity weighed twice as much. Piastri wasn't just competing against rivals, he was competing against the expectation of becoming something more. And this is where the true meaning of Japan begins to be built. Because when we get to Suzuka, what we see is not just another podium in the championship. What we see is the first clear sign that that internal change, that reset, that Webber talked about, is finally taking real shape on the track. It's not just the result, it's how you get to that result, how you manage the pressure, how you execute when you have a limited opportunity. Therefore, Webber's message after the race cannot be interpreted as a simple congratulation. It is the validation of all that previous process. It is confirmation that Piastri has begun to become the driver he was required to be. Because when Oscar Piastri crosses the finish line and achieves that result, what is really at stake is not the celebration. It is the interpretation of what it means. And that's where Mark Webber's message comes in, which far from being simply emotional, functions as a key piece within a much larger narrative. For months, Webber had built a very specific pressure on his driver. It was not enough to be fast, it was not enough to have talent. You had to demonstrate the ability to execute at the right moment. And Suzuka represents just that. It wasn't a perfect weekend, it wasn't absolute dominance. It was a limited opportunity, in conditions where the margin for error was minimal, and Piastri responded. That is what changes the internal reading completely. This is where the message takes on a double edge. Because when Webber expresses that pride, when he highlights the performance and the way in which Piastri capitalizes on the occasion, he is actually pointing out something much deeper. This is what I asked of you. There is no uncontrolled euphoria, there is no surprise, there is validation. And that, in an environment like Formula One, is even more demanding than criticism. Furthermore, this moment comes in a context where McLaren is no longer an outsider, it is a team that is forced to fight at the top, with a competitive car and a structure that has been growing since 2024. This means that each result stops being anecdotal and begins to be evaluated as part of a real candidacy for the championship. And in that scenario, the podium in Japan does not raise the pressure, it redefines it. Because now the problem is no longer if Piastri can do it, but if he can repeat it. And here is the true point of tension of the act. Webber's message does not free Piastri, it places him on a new level of demand. From this moment on, each race stops being an opportunity to demonstrate potential and becomes an obligation to confirm that this change is real. The margin of patience disappears. The most interesting thing is that these types of situations have defined entire careers in Formula One. There are drivers who achieve that mental click and build a solid career from there, and others who, after reaching that point, cannot sustain it under the constant pressure of the environment, the team, and the media narrative. Therefore, the Suzuka podium is not the end of a story, it is the beginning of the most dangerous one. Because now that Piastri has shown that he can be there, there is no turning back. And this is where everything becomes much more uncomfortable. Because the true effect of Mark Webber's message is not measured in Japan, it is measured in what comes next. Because when Oscar Piastri comes off the podium in Suzuka, he is no longer the same driver in the paddock. He is no longer the promise that he is learning, now he is the driver who has shown that he can execute under pressure. And that completely changes the rules of the game. From this point on, each weekend stops being an opportunity for growth and becomes a constant test. There is no longer room to disappear at key moments, there is no longer room for those weekends where things simply don't work out. Because now, every time he is not at that level, the comparison will be inevitable. What happened to the pilot we saw in Japan? And that's where Webber's message becomes something much bigger than just a post-race reaction. Because by publicly validating that performance, you're also setting a new standard. You are saying, without saying it directly, that this is the minimum level expected as of now. It's not a ceiling, it's the new floor. But the most critical thing is not only the external pressure, it is the internal one. Because Piastri now knows he can do it. And in Formula One, that is a double-edged sword. When a pilot reaches that level and recognizes it, he can no longer hide behind the process, learning or adaptation. Now he competes against his own best version. And that's what really defines the greats, or breaks them. Furthermore, the context of the championship is not forgiving. With McLaren consolidated as one of the strong teams and fighting at the top, every point counts, every decision weighs, every mistake is amplified. And in that environment, sustaining performance isn't just difficult. It's what separates the real contenders from those who fall by the wayside. Therefore, the podium in Japan is not the climax of this story, it is the beginning of the most dangerous phase. Because now comes the hardest part of all, repeating it, when everyone expects you to do it. And this is where everything is defined. Because if Piastri manages to sustain this level, then Webber's message will have been the exact point where a real candidate for the title was born. But if not, then that same message will become the constant reminder of what could have been, and was not. If you want, I can expand this last block even further and delve into Piastri's future scenarios within the championship. And in the end, it all comes down to one idea. Mark Webber's message wasn't a congratulations, it was a line in the sand. Because Oscar Piastri's podium in Japan does not close a story, it starts it. It is the exact moment in which it stops being a promise and begins to be measured as a reality within Formula One. And that, in this sport, changes absolutely everything. For months, the narrative revolved around what he lacked: character, consistency, ability to respond under pressure. But Suzuka answers all those doubts in one go. And that is exactly why Webber's message has so much weight. Because it does not add new pressure, it simply confirms that now there are no excuses. This is the level. And when that level is publicly exposed, there is no turning back. Every race, every classification, every strategic decision will be evaluated under that standard. It's no longer about arriving, it's about staying. That's the real difficulty. Because many drivers in history have had moments like this, flashes where everything fits, where they show that they can be among the best. But very few manage to turn that moment into a constant. And that is the border that Piastri now faces. Therefore, Webber's message is not only important for what it says, but for what it implies. It implies that the process is finished. It implies that the version we saw in Japan is no longer an exception. It is the reference. And from now on, there are only two possible paths. Either Piastri builds from here a real candidacy for the title, or this podium becomes the highest point of an expectation that was never fully fulfilled. The difference between those two scenarios starts in the next race. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.